The wind carried dust across the small frontier town, sweeping through the cracks of wooden houses and whispering across the dry plains like a restless spirit. The late afternoon sun bled across the horizon, painting the land in copper and gold. It was quiet, except for the occasional cry of a hawk circling above and the creak of the old windmill at the edge of town. The desert had its own voice, steady and low, and anyone who had lived long enough in the West learned to listen to it. It warned of storms, strangers, and secrets buried deep in the sand. She was hanging laundry behind her cabin when she first heard the sound. It wasn't the usual rustle of the wind or the call of an animal. It was faint, human, like a groan carried on the air. She froze, her hands gripping the damp sheet, eyes narrowing toward the line of cottonwoods near the creek bed. For a long moment, there was only silence again, and she thought she might have imagined it. But then she heard it once more, softer this time, almost pleading. Her heart beat faster as she stepped away from the clothesline and walked toward the sound. The ground was hard and cracked beneath her boots, the air dry and still. When she reached the edge of the trees, she saw him lying there, an Apache man, blood darkening his torn shirt, one arm clutching his side. His eyes were closed, his face drawn and pale beneath streaks of dust. For a second, fear gripped her so tightly she could hardly breathe. The stories she'd heard about Apache raids came rushing back, the burned wagons, the missing travelers, the warnings from soldiers stationed nearby. But something stopped her from turning back. Maybe it was the way his chest rose weakly, or how young he looked despite the hard lines of his face. He wasn't holding a weapon. His horse was nowhere in sight. He was wounded, alone, and dying. She stood over him, torn between fear and pity, and then, before she could talk herself out of it, she knelt beside him. "Can you hear me?" she whispered. His eyelids fluttered open, revealing dark eyes filled with pain, but also something deeper: caution, pride, and a flicker of defiance. He tried to speak, but his voice broke. His lips moved, forming words she didn't understand, maybe in his own language. He reached weakly for his wound, and she saw the blood again, fresh and deep. Instinct took over. She ran back to her cabin and grabbed a blanket, some water, and a strip of linen. When she returned, he was trying to push himself up, his breath coming in short gasps. "Don't move," she said quickly. "You'll make it worse." He looked at her like he didn't trust her, which made sense. The feeling was mutual, but she didn't hesitate. She tore a strip of cloth and pressed it to his side. He flinched, his hand shooting up to grab her wrist, strong even in weakness. For a moment, their eyes locked, hers wide with fear, his sharp with confusion. Then his grip loosened, and he let her help him by nightfall. She had dragged him inside her cabin. It was a small place, one room with a stone fireplace, a table, and a narrow bed. She laid him near the fire and cleaned the wound as best she could, whispering prayers she hadn't said in years. The whole time, she kept glancing toward the window, half expecting someone to come riding down the trail. The nearest town was a few miles away, and soldiers sometimes passed through looking for Apache bands. If anyone found out she was hiding one, she'd be branded a traitor or worse. But she couldn't turn him in. Not like this. He was hurt, hunted, and barely holding on to life. She told herself she'd help him just until he could walk again, then send him on his way. That would be the decent thing to do. As the firelight flickered, she studied him. He was young, perhaps no older than 25. His skin was bronzed by the sun, his features strong and calm, even in sleep. Around his neck hung a leather cord with a small carved piece of bone shaped like an eagle. She'd seen something like it once before, years ago. When a trader passed through wearing Apache trinkets he claimed came from a powerful chief. She wondered who this man was, what tribe he came from, and what had brought him so far from his people. The next morning, the sound of hooves shattered the quiet. She peeked through the curtain and saw 3 riders approaching. Soldiers. Her heart slammed against her ribs. She hurried back to the man lying near the hearth. He was awake now, his eyes alert, though his body was weak. "Soldiers," she whispered. "They're coming." He tensed immediately, trying to sit up, but she pressed her hand against his shoulder. "Don't move," she said. "You'll bleed again." Then she did something she never thought she would. She covered him with a quilt, pushed a crate in front of the bed, and moved quickly to the door. The soldiers dismounted and knocked hard, their voices sharp. She opened the door, forcing a nervous smile. "Morning, ma'am," one said. "We're looking for an Apache. Escaped near the ridge last night. Dangerous man. You've seen anything?" Her stomach knotted. She shook her head slowly. "No, sir. Haven't seen a soul since yesterday. Just trying to keep the dust out of my doorway." The man glanced past her into the cabin, his eyes scanning the dim interior. "Mind if we take a look?" She hesitated. "Ain't much to see, but sure." They stepped inside, boots thudding against the wooden floor. Her heart pounded as they moved around the room. One soldier nudged the crate with his boot, but it didn't move far. She forced herself to keep breathing, her hands trembling as she wiped them on her apron. Finally, the officer turned back to her. "If you see anything or anyone, send word to Fort Mason. This one's dangerous." "I will," she said softly, when the soldiers left. She waited until their horses disappeared over the ridge before she dared move the crate again. The man beneath the blanket opened his eyes, breathing heavily. "You didn't tell them," he said in a rough voice. His English was broken, but clear enough. "I couldn't," she answered. "You wouldn't have made it if they took you." He looked at her for a long moment, unreadable. Why help Apache? She didn't have an answer. Maybe it was because she'd lost enough people to know what pain looked like. Maybe it was because she was tired of everyone fighting and killing for land and pride. Whatever it was, she couldn't explain it even to herself. "Because you needed help," she finally said. "That's all." Days passed, and he began to heal slowly. He spoke little, though sometimes she caught him watching her with quiet curiosity. Once she asked his name, but he didn't answer. Another time, she saw him touch the eagle pendant around his neck and whisper something under his breath. She didn't press. She sensed there was something he wasn't telling her, something heavy that hung in the air between them. Then one night, as thunder rolled across the plains and lightning lit up the sky, he finally spoke more than a few words. "My father," he said, staring into the fire. "They hunt me because of him." "Who's your father?" He turned his head toward her, eyes dark as the storm outside. "The great chief," he said quietly. Her breath caught. The stories came back about the mighty Apache leader who had led raids against settlers, who outwitted entire companies of soldiers, who had vanished months ago into the desert. She realized then that the man lying in her cabin wasn't just a fugitive. He was the son of the most feared leader in the territory. The rain lashed against the window, thunder shaking the cabin walls. For a long time, neither of them spoke. She felt the weight of what she had done settle over her, heavy and cold. She had saved him, hidden him, led to soldiers for him. Man, now she understood the danger that came with it. Outside, the storm raged. Inside, the fire burned low. And she knew that, when the dawn came, her life would never be the same again. The storm passed by dawn, leaving the land washed clean and quiet. The sky turned pale, the desert glistening under a thin mist that clung to the sagebrush and dry grass. She stood by the window watching the horizon brighten, her thoughts restless. Inside, the Apache man still slept near the fire, his breathing steady now. Every so often, he murmured something in his language. Words she couldn't understand, but could feel carried pain and memory. She hadn't slept much. The truth of who he was had kept her wide awake. The son of the great chief, the same man whose name soldiers spoke with a mix of fear and hatred. It was hard to believe that the one lying in her cabin, quiet and wounded, belonged to that same world of raids and battles. But the way he had said it, low and certain, left no doubt. She kept asking herself what he was doing this far from his people. Was he fleeing? Was he lost? Or was there something he wasn't telling her? When he finally stirred, she handed him water. His hands shook a little as he drank, but his eyes were clearer than before. He didn't thank her, not with words anyway. Instead, he gave a small nod, one that felt more sincere than speech. "You can't stay here long," she said after a moment. "If the soldiers come back, they'll search every inch of this place. You'll be safer in the hills." He looked toward the door, then back at her. "You tell them I am gone?" She shook her head. "No, But they'll come again. They always do. He studied her face, as if trying to understand the reason behind her worry. You afraid of them? I'm afraid of losing what little I have, she said, and of what they'll do if they find you here. There was silence after that. The fire crackled softly, and outside a crow cawed in the distance. He leaned back against the wall, his expression unreadable. I did not ask for help, he said quietly. I know, she replied, but you needed it. I know, she replied, but you needed it. The days that followed moved slowly. The air grew warmer, and the earth began to dry again after the rain. He regained his strength little by little, helping her with small chores around the cabin when he could chop in wood, fetching water from the creek, fixing the broken latch on the barn door. She didn't ask him about his past again, though she could feel the weight of it hanging between them. Sometimes at night, she would sit outside by the steps, watching the stars come out over the desert. He would join her, sitting a few feet away, quiet and still. They didn't talk much, but the silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was as if they both understood that words weren't needed to share the same air, the same uneasy peace. One evening, she noticed him studying the land, his eyes tracing the line of hills in the distance. You're thinking of leaving, she said. He nodded. My people wait for me. Do they know you're alive? He hesitated. They think I am dead. Soldiers came to our camp months ago. Many were killed. I was taken. His voice tightened. I escaped when they moved me toward the fort. She listened quietly, her hands folded in her lap. So they've been hunting you since then? Yes, they want the son of the chief. They think if they catch me, my father will surrender. She asked softly. His eyes darkened. No chief surrenders. Not while his people live. There was pride in his tone, but also pain. She could hear it, even if he tried to hide it. The thought of him being used as bait in a war he didn't start made her chest ache. She didn't know much about the fighting between settlers and the Apache beyond the stories told in town, and those stories always painted one side as savage and the other as righteous. But now, looking at him, she wasn't so sure who the real enemy was. Later that night, when the fire burned low, she found herself asking something that had been circling her mind since the night he told her the truth. If they come again, what will you do? He looked up at her, eyes steady. Fight, even if it means dying? If I die free. The answer chilled her. Freedom meant something different to him than it did to her. To her, it was the quiet of her cabin, the stretch of land she called her own. To him, it was survival, dignity, the right to live without being hunted. She wanted to understand that, but part of her was afraid to. The next morning, she went into town for supplies. The air felt heavier there, the streets quieter than usual. As she stepped into the general store, she heard two men talking near the counter. They say the soldiers found signs of him near the creek, one of them said. Tracks, blood, maybe a piece of torn cloth. He can't be far. Her stomach tightened. She kept her face calm as she paid for her flour and salt, but her mind was racing. When she stepped outside, she saw a group of soldiers riding through the main road, their faces set with purpose. They were searching again. By the time she reached home, she could feel the panic rising inside her. He was outside, repairing a fence post, his shirt damp with sweat. When he saw her expression, he knew something was wrong. They're close, she said, breathless. They found tracks near the creek. You have to leave before they come this way. He frowned. They will follow. I cannot run far like this, then hide, she insisted. At least until they pass. He looked toward the open land beyond her cabin, then back at her. If they find you helping me again, they will punish you. I'll take that risk, she said. You just have to live. He didn't argue after that. Together, they moved quickly, packing a few supplies and leading him to an old cellar behind the barn, half covered by weeds and dirt. It wasn't much, but it was deep enough to hide him if soldiers came. She helped him climb down, her hands shaking as she handed him a small lantern. If they come, don't make a sound, she whispered. Wait until nightfall. He looked up at her, his face calm even as danger drew closer. Why do you do this? He asked again. She hesitated. Because I couldn't live with myself if I didn't. Their eyes met one last time before she closed the cellar door and covered it with boards. She could still hear the faint creak of his movement below before silence settled again. Moments later, the sound of hooves echoed through the yard. Soldiers. Her breath caught as she wiped her hands and stepped back toward the front of the cabin, forcing her face into calmness. Morning again. "Ma'am," the officer said, tipping his hat slightly. "Mind if we ask you a few more questions?" She nodded, trying not to look toward the barn. "Of course. We tracked the fugitive through the creek," he continued. "Looks like he passed near your property. You sure you haven't seen anything?" She met his gaze steadily. "I told you before, I haven't." The man's eyes narrowed. "We might need to search your land. Just to be safe." Her heart pounded. "If it'll help you sleep at night, go ahead." They spread out, checking behind the cabin, the barn, even the small corral where her horse stood nervously. Every second felt like an hour. She stood still, watching, trying not to let the fear show. When one soldier moved toward the cellar, her throat went dry. Before he could reach it, thunder cracked in the distance, another storm brewing on the horizon. The officer called the men back, muttering something about losing daylight. "If he's around, he won't get far," the officer said. "We'll be back tomorrow." When they finally left, she waited until their sound faded before hurrying to the cellar. She lifted the boards, her hands trembling. He was there, crouched in the dim light, his eyes calm but wary. "They're gone," she said softly. He climbed out slowly, breathing hard, and for the first time, she saw something like gratitude in his eyes. "You risk much," he said. "For someone you do not know." "I think I know enough," she replied. That night, neither of them slept much. The soldiers would return soon, and they both knew it. Outside, the storm gathered again, lightning flashing over the plains. Inside, the fire flickered, throwing long shadows on the walls. He sat near the window, watching the rain begin to fall. "If I go, they will follow," he said quietly. "If I stay, they will find me. Either way, someone will die." She looked at him, her voice barely a whisper. "Then what do we do?" He didn't answer right away. His gaze stayed fixed on the dark land outside. Finally, he said, "When the sun rises, I will go where no soldier dares to follow." She felt a chill at his words, but didn't ask what he meant. Outside, the thunder rolled closer, and the night seemed endless. She knew that whatever came next would change everything for him, for her, and for the quiet desert that kept their secret hidden beneath the restless wind. The wind had a restless sound that night, as if the desert itself was uneasy about what was to come. The storm that had rolled in earlier had passed, but the air still smelled of rain and dust. The woman sat near the fire, unable to calm her thoughts. The Apache man was silent across from her, sharpening a small knife with slow, steady movements. His eyes reflected the firelight, and there was a look in them that made her uneasy, a quiet resolve that told her he had already made a decision she wouldn't be able to change. "You can't just walk out there." "Oh," she said finally, breaking the silence. "They'll be waiting." "You'll never make it." He paused, the edge of the knife catching the glow of the flame. "They hunt me because they fear my father," he said. "If I stay, they will burn your home to find me. If I go, they will follow me away from here." "You think leaving will protect me?" she asked, her voice unsteady. "If they find out I helped you, I'll be the one they punish." His expression softened slightly, but his tone stayed firm. "Then I must go before dawn." The fire popped, and the sound made her jump. She didn't answer him right away. Her mind drifted back to the last time soldiers had come through this land, when they'd burned a nearby homestead to the ground because someone had offered food to a wounded Apache. She still remembered the smell of smoke, the way the sky turned red for hours. The woman who lived there had been her friend once, before everything changed. That memory still haunted her, and she could feel the same danger circling her now. "You don't even know where you're going," she said quietly. He looked toward the window, where the moonlight cast pale lines across the floor. "I will find the hills where my people hide." The soldiers do not know that land. They fear the caves and the narrow trails. She shook her head. "They'll track you. You're not strong enough yet," gave a faint, humorless smile. "You forget, I was born in the desert. The land hides me. There was no arguing with that. The desert had raised him the way hardship had raised her. Both of them had learned to survive by listening to the wind, to the silence, to the instincts that kept them alive. She stared at him across the dim room, realizing that whatever bound them together wasn't just circumstance. It was something deeper, an understanding that came from being caught between danger and the will to keep going. Later, when the fire burned low, she went outside to clear her thoughts. The moon hung low, half covered by clouds. The land stretched endlessly in all directions, quiet except for the low rustle of dry grass. She could still see the faint tracks of the soldiers' horses in the dirt near the gate. The sight made her chest tighten. They would return soon. They always did. She turned back toward the cabin and froze. A shadow moved near the barn. Her pulse quickened as she reached for the rifle leaning by the door. "Who's there?" she called softly. There was a pause, then a familiar voice answered, "It's just me." Her shoulders eased slightly as her neighbor stepped into the moonlight. He was an older man, rough-faced and kind-eyed, with a hat pulled low over his brow. "Didn't mean to scare you," he said. "Saw your light still burning. Thought I'd check in." She lowered the rifle but didn't relax completely. "Everything all right?" He nodded toward the open land. "Depends what you mean by all right. The soldiers are restless. Say they're closing in on that Apache fugitive. They're searching every ranch and cabin in the area." Her stomach turned. "That close?" "Close enough." He studied her face for a long moment. "You seen anything? Anyone pass through here lately?" Her throat went dry. "No, haven't seen a thing." He looked like he wanted to believe her, but there was something cautious in his eyes. "Just be careful. You know how they get when they're desperate? Anyone caught helping him won't get much mercy." "I'll remember that," she said softly. When he left, she stood in the doorway for a long time, watching his figure fade into the night. Her heart ached with guilt. Lying wasn't in her nature, but she'd done it twice in 1 week, first to the soldiers, now to someone she'd known for years. Every choice she made seemed to pull her deeper into trouble. Inside, the Apache man was still awake. He looked up as she entered. "Someone came," he said quietly. "Yes," she answered. "My neighbor. He warned me they're searching again." He nodded slowly. "Then I must leave before the sun." She wanted to protest, to tell him that running into the desert alone was as good as walking to his death. But she saw the determination in his face. He had the same look her father used to get when he made up his mind about something dangerous but necessary. It was useless to argue. Still, she couldn't let him go without some kind of plan. "If you go," she said, "take the trail by the canyon. It's rocky, harder for them to track. There's an old line shack near the ridge. You can hide there for a day or two if you need rest." He studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "You have helped me more than I deserve." She looked away, her voice barely above a whisper. "No one deserves to be hunted." Before dawn, she packed a small bag with dried bread, jerky, and water. When she handed it to him, he took it carefully, his fingers brushing hers. "If I live," he said, "I will remember this." "Just make sure you live," she replied. She stood in the doorway as he disappeared into the first light of morning. The land swallowed him up quickly, the way it always did with those who belonged to it. She waited long after he was gone, until the sun rose high enough to warm the earth, before finally closing the door. That day felt heavier than the others. Every noise outside made her tense. Every knock of the wind against the shutters sounded like boots on the porch. When the soldiers came again around noon, she was ready. She'd been standing at the stove, trying to keep her hands steady as she stirred a pot of beans, when their voices called from outside. "Ma'am, we're conducting another search," the officer said. "Mind if we come in?" She forced a calm smile. "You already searched this place." He stepped inside anyway, his boots tracking dust across the floor. "And now we're doing it again." The fugitive was seen near the ridge this morning. Not far from here. Her pulse raced. She thought of the trail she'd told him to take, the same one near that ridge. She prayed he'd stayed off it. The soldiers moved through the cabin, overturning a few crates, checking corners, lifting blankets. One of them picked up the small carved eagle that had been left behind on the table. Her breath caught. She hadn't even noticed he'd forgotten it. "What's this?" the soldier asked. "Just a trinket," she said quickly. "Found it by the creek a few days ago." He studied her, then dropped it back on the table. "You find a lot of things out here, don't you?" "Only trouble," she said softly. When they finally left, she collapsed into the nearest chair, her hands shaking. The eagle pendant sat on the table, catching the sunlight. She reached for it, turning it over in her palm. The carving was simple but strong, worn smooth by years of touch. It wasn't just decoration, it was a mark of family, of identity. Losing it must have meant something to him. That night, the air grew cold again. She kept the pendant close, unable to stop thinking about where he might be. Maybe he'd found shelter. Maybe he'd been caught. The not knowing was its own kind of torment. She went to bed but couldn't sleep. Every sound made her flinch. Near midnight, a faint knock came from the door. Her heart stopped. Slowly, she reached for the rifle and moved toward the sound. "Who's there?" she called. "It's me," came the voice, a whisper she recognized. She opened the door, and there he was, standing in the shadows, soaked in dust and sweat. His face was pale, his breathing rough. "They followed," he said weakly. "They are close." Without thinking, she pulled him inside and shut the door. "You shouldn't have come back." "I had no choice," he said, sinking to the floor. "They found the line shack. Burned it." Fear surged through her. "Then we have to move. They'll come here next." He nodded, grimacing as he tried to stand. "They know this land, but not the old canyon trail. There's a place there where the rocks swallow sound. If we reach it before sunrise, they won't find us." "We?" she asked. He looked at her, his voice steady, despite the pain. "You saved me. They will kill you if you stay." She hesitated, torn between fear and the growing sense that her life, as simple as it was, had already crossed a line it couldn't return from. The soldiers would come. The neighbors would talk. The truth would spread. She glanced at the fire, then at him. "Then we leave before dawn." Outside, the wind picked up again, carrying the sound of distant hooves. The desert stretched wide and waiting, silent witness to the choices they would soon make. The night air was cold and heavy, carrying the smell of dust and smoke from somewhere far off. The woman wrapped a shawl around her shoulders as she helped the Apache man gather what little they could carry. There wasn't time for much. Some dried food, a canteen, and the small rifle she had kept behind the stove. Every sound outside felt sharper, every creak of the floor louder than it should be. The tension hung between them like a living thing. He moved slowly but with purpose, favoring his injured side. The cut that had nearly killed him had reopened during his flight from the soldiers. And though he hid the pain well, she could see it in the tightness of his jaw. "You shouldn't be walking," she said in a low voice. He shook his head. "I can still move. If I stop now, they will find us before sunrise." She glanced toward the window. In the faint light, she could see movement in the distant tiny flickers that could have been campfires or lanterns. The soldiers were spreading out. They were close. He noticed it too. His gaze hardened. "They know you helped me," he said. The words sent a chill through her. "How could they?" "Someone told them," he answered. "Soldiers do not search the same land twice, unless they know what they're looking for." Her mind raced. She thought of her neighbor, the old man who had stopped by the night before. He had seemed kind, worried even. But maybe that worry had been guilt. Maybe the soldiers had forced his hand. Either way, she couldn't think about that now. He motioned toward the door. "We leave now." They stepped out into the darkness, the only light coming from the sliver of moon above the desert. The land stretched wide and silent, broken only by the faint outline of the canyon in the far distance. That was where they were headed, the hidden trail where he said the rocks could swallow sound. They walked quickly, staying low, the dry grass crunching softly beneath their boots. The wind pressed against them, whispering through the brush. Each time an owl cried in the distance, she flinched, expecting shouts or gunfire to follow. But the night stayed quiet. After a while, her breath grew short and her legs ached from climbing over rough ground. "How much farther?" she whispered. He stopped and looked ahead, scanning the land. "Past the next ridge. There is a narrow path there. Once we reach it, the wind will cover our scent and the trail." She nodded, forcing herself to keep going. The silence between them wasn't just fear, it was something heavier, something that came from knowing each step might be their last. Behind them, faintly, came the distant echo of horses. She turned sharply. "They're following." He didn't look back. "We must move faster." They pushed onward, half running, half stumbling, until they reached the foot of the ridge. The climb was steep, and the loose stones shifted under their feet. The woman slipped once, scraping her hands against the rock, but he caught her arm before she fell. Even wounded, his strength was steady. When they finally reached the top, the view stole her breath. The desert stretched endlessly below, silver under the moonlight, beautiful and haunting all at once. But there was no time to stop. The man motioned to a narrow trail leading down into a shadowed canyon. "This way," he said. The path twisted sharply, flanked by tall stone walls that rose like jagged teeth. The air grew colder the deeper they went. Every sound seemed to vanish, just like he had said. Even their footsteps became faint. For a short while, it felt like they had escaped. She dared to breathe easier. Then, somewhere behind them, a rock tumbled down the slope. The sound was small, but unmistakable. She froze. He turned, listening. "They are here," he whispered. "How can they move so fast?" She asked. "They ride horses," he said. "We do not." They ducked behind a cluster of boulders as torchlight flickered at the top of the ridge. Voices followed, distant but closing in. She could make out the sharp tone of the officer who had visited her cabin. "Spread out," he barked. "They can't have gone far." Her hands trembled as she held the rifle close. The Apache man placed a hand on her arm, shaking his head. "No shooting. Sound will bring them all." "Then what do we do?" she whispered. He glanced at the dark stretch of canyon ahead. "There's a cave not far from here. We can hide until morning." They crept along the rock wall, careful not to make a sound. The flickering light behind them grew brighter, the soldiers moving closer with every step. At last, they reached a narrow opening between two slabs of stone. He led her through it, into the cold dark of the cave beyond. Inside, the air was damp and still. The walls glimmered faintly with traces of quartz, catching bits of moonlight that filtered through cracks in the stone. They crouched low, listening. The shouts outside echoed faintly, then faded as the soldiers spread farther down the canyon. For the first time in hours, she exhaled. "We might be safe," she whispered. He didn't answer. His attention was fixed on the entrance. "For now," he said quietly. She leaned against the wall, trying to steady her breathing. Her hands were scraped, her dress torn, her throat dry. But worse than the exhaustion was the fear that at any moment, torchlight might sweep across the opening, giving them away. Minutes turned into hours. The night dragged on, heavy with silence. She could hear the distant rumble of thunder again, another storm moving across the plains. The air grew colder, and she wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders. Finally she spoke. "If we make it through this, what will you do?" He hesitated. "Return to my people," he said. "If any still live, they'll come for you again," she said. "The soldiers won't stop." He looked at her, his expression unreadable. "Then they will have to catch me again." She wanted to believe there was hope, that they could both walk out of this alive, but the truth hung in the air between them. The world didn't forgive easily, and mercy was rare in the desert. As dawn began to break, faint orange glow touched the canyon walls. The Apache man moved toward the entrance to look outside, but she caught his arm. "Don't," she whispered. They could still be there. He paused, listening. There was no sound now, no horses, no voices. Just the slow drip of water from the rocks and the wind sighing through the cracks. "They're gone," he said at last. She wasn't convinced, but she followed him out. The early light made everything look strange and new. The ground was marked with hoofprints and ashes from a small fire near the ridge. The soldiers had been close to close. They started walking again, keeping low. The sun climbed higher, bringing heat and the dry taste of dust. By midday, they reached a small rise overlooking the desert. From there, they could see the long road leading back toward the settlements, a faint line in the distance. For a moment, she felt a pull toward it, the thought of home, safety, familiarity. But then she remembered the soldiers searching her cabin, the look in their eyes when they found the carving on the table. There was no going back. He stopped and turned to her. "You do not have to come farther," he said. "Your place is behind you." She shook her head. "If I go back, they'll find me. I've already crossed the line. There's no undoing it now." He studied her, and something changed in his expression. Respect, maybe, or sorrow. "Then we walked together," he said. The heat pressed down harder as the day wore on. They found little shade, and their water was nearly gone. The land stretched ahead, harsh and endless. Each step felt heavier than the last. In the afternoon, they spotted movement in the distant figures on horseback. Too far to make out clearly, but close enough to feel danger. "They found the trail," she said, her voice trembling. He looked ahead, eyes narrowing. "We reach the cliffs before night, or we die in the open." They started running again, the dry wind burning their faces. The riders grew clearer behind them, now soldiers moving fast, the sunlight flashing off their rifles. The woman's lungs ached, her heart pounding so hard she could hardly breathe. Still, she didn't stop. The ground sloped upward again, toward the rocky cliffs that rose like sentinels above the desert. The Apache man turned back once, his face grim. "Almost there," he said, but even as he spoke, a shot cracked through the air. The sound echoed across the canyon. The woman stumbled, the fear gripping her so hard she could barely think. "Keep moving," he shouted, grabbing her arm. They ran, stones scattering under their boots. The path narrowed, twisting between steep walls. The riders were closing in now. Shouts, the thunder of hooves. Another gunshot. The sound of it tore through the air like a warning. When they reached the edge of the cliff, she froze. Below was a steep drop, the ground lost in shadow. There was nowhere left to go. The Apache man turned, his knife drawn, eyes fierce and steady. The soldiers' voices echoed closer, their torches flickering against the rocks. "Stay behind me," he said. His tone calm, almost resigned. Her hands trembled as she clutched the rifle. The air thick with dust and fear. She could hear the soldiers shouting orders now, their boots striking stone, their guns ready. The man looked at her one last time. "Whatever happens next," he said, "don't let them take you." The first rider appeared at the mouth of the canyon, his gun raised. The woman held her breath, her finger tight on the trigger. The Apache warrior's shadow stretched long across the cliff. The rising sun, turning the sky to fire as the battle she'd feared all along, finally came to meet them. The sound of gunfire tore through the canyon, echoing against the rocks like thunder. Dust filled the air, stinging her eyes, but she didn't stop moving. The Apache warrior stood firm, every motion deliberate, as if he had accepted what would come. She could hear the soldiers shouting orders, their boots pounding closer. Her heart raced so hard it felt like it might burst. Then in the confusion, the ground beneath them trembled. A piece of the cliff edge crumbled away, sending stones tumbling into the shadows below. The soldiers hesitated, their horses pulling back from the edge. The Apache man took that moment to fire a single shot. It hit the ground near the soldiers' feet, startling them and buying just enough time. He turned to her and said in a voice both calm and fierce, "Go now." She shook her head. "I won't leave you," gave her a look that held both gratitude and sorrow. "If you stay, we both die. You must live." The decision cut deep, but she knew he was right. Crawling low, she slipped behind a large boulder, using the smoke and dust as cover. She could hear the gunfire again, sharper now, and then silence. For a few terrible moments, the world stood still. When the noise finally faded, she dared to look. The soldiers were gone, their shapes disappearing into the desert, and the Apache warrior was nowhere to be seen. Panic surged through her as she scrambled across the rocks, calling his name. There was no answer, only the low wind and the quiet hum of the earth after chaos. Then, from behind a ledge, she saw him. He was hurt, leaning against the stone, breathing hard but alive. She rushed to him, tears welling in her eyes. "You're alive," she whispered. He managed a faint smile. "For now." She tore a piece of her shawl and pressed it against the wound. "We'll get you to safety. There must be somewhere we can go." He shook his head slowly. "You saved me once already." "That was enough," she said firmly. "We both survived this." He looked at her with quiet strength. "If I stay, they will never stop hunting you. But if I go, they will believe you are innocent, that you helped only out of fear." Her throat tightened. "I can't let you die out here." He reached out, his hand warm against hers. "You already gave me back something I thought was lost hope." For a long moment, neither spoke. The sun climbed higher, painting the desert gold and red. It felt like the world was holding its breath, waiting for something to end. Finally, he stood, unsteady but determined. "There is a river 2 days from here," he said. "If I reach it, I can find my people again." She looked out at the endless stretch of desert and knew how hard that journey would be. But his eyes held a kind of peace, the kind that comes when a man knows his path, no matter how hard it is. She nodded slowly. "Then go. I'll stay behind long enough to send them the other way." He hesitated, then gave a small bow of gratitude before turning toward the horizon. She watched him go until his figure became one with the land, shadow moving through the light. When she finally turned back toward the road, she saw dust rising far away. More riders. She hurried down the canyon, hiding in the brush near her cabin as the soldiers returned. Their leader dismounted and scanned the ground. Frustration etched across his face. "There's no sign of him," one of the men said. The officer kicked at the dirt. "He can't have gone far." But the woman she answered for this. She stepped out slowly, her voice steady. "He's gone. I saw him fall." The officer looked at her hard, as if searching her face for the truth. "You're sure?" She nodded. "He's gone. You have no reason to stay." After a tense moment, the officer gave a short nod. "Burn what's left of his trail," he ordered. Then he turned his horse and rode off, the others following behind. The sound of hooves faded until the desert was silent again. Only then did she let herself breathe. The relief came with tears she hadn't realized she'd been holding back. She sank to her knees, exhausted, the sun warming her face, as if to remind her that she was still alive. Days passed. She stayed at her cabin, fixing what she could, trying to return to the rhythm of life before everything changed. But nothing truly went back to how it was. Each morning, she looked toward the horizon, half expecting to see a distant figure walking back from the desert. Sometimes at night, she would sit by the fire and think about the things he had said, the stories of his people, the way he spoke of freedom and dignity, of how the land carried memory like blood. His words stayed with her, reshaping how she saw everything. When the rains finally came, she stepped outside and watched the drops hit the dry earth, soaking into the soil. She thought about how the land could heal itself, how life found a way to begin again, even after the harshest seasons. Maybe people were the same. Weeks turned into months. The soldiers stopped coming. The war between settlers and the Apache drifted farther away, becoming another story whispered in taverns and markets. But for her, it was not a story. It was a piece of her life that lived quietly in her memory. One evening, as the sun set behind the canyon, she saw movement near the ridge. Her heart raced, but when the shape came closer, she saw it was only a rider passing through. Still, something about his silhouette made her pause. The rider stopped at the edge of her fence, nodded once, then turned away into the fading light. She never saw his face, but she didn't need to. From that day on, she no longer felt alone. She knew he had survived. Somewhere beyond the desert, he had found his way back to his people, carrying with him the small part of humanity she had offered years later. When her hair had turned silver and her steps had slowed, travelers passing through would stop at her cabin for water or shelter. They would tell her stories of peace talks, of tribes finding new lands, of a tall Apache man who guided families safely across dangerous country. Each time she heard his name, she smiled quietly, knowing the stories were true. The cabin became a place of rest for wanderers, a symbol of kindness in a land that had known too much pain. And though she never spoke openly about those days, people often said she carried a kind of calm that couldn't be taught, like someone who had seen death and chosen mercy instead. As the years went on, the land itself changed. Fences rose where open plains once stretched, towns grew where silence once ruled. But the wind still carried the same scent of dust and sage, and the canyon still stood, scarred and strong. Sometimes when the evening light turned the stones red, she would imagine the past not as something lost, but as something still alive beneath the surface. When her final days came, she sat on her porch and watched the sun sink behind the horizon. The sky painted in colors she could never name. She thought of the journey she had taken, the choices she had made, and the man whose spirit had changed her understanding of courage. In the quiet of that last evening, the air felt lighter, as if carrying a silent promise between two souls who had once crossed paths in the vastness of the desert. And when the wind moved through the canyon, it sounded like a whisper, a reminder that even in the hardest places, compassion could survive. The story of the woman and the Apache warrior became a legend told by travelers and families for generations. They spoke of how kindness could bridge even the deepest divides, how courage was not in fighting but in protecting what was right, and how two people from different worlds could find humanity in each other, long after her cabin fell to dust. Wildflowers still bloomed where it once stood, and sometimes, when the sun rose over the ridge, people swore they saw two figures walking side by side through the light, one carrying the spirit of the land, the other carrying the memory of love that never needed words. The desert, in its quiet way, kept their story alive, reminding all who listened that no act of kindness is ever truly forgotten. Top of form, bottom of form.